Guthrie is a fellow at the Faith and Progressive Policy Institute at American Progress, focuses on a wide range of issues, including progressive vision of religious liberty that champions LGBTQ rights and amplifying how faith communities empower social and economic justice. He's got his undergraduate from American University and his Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary. So with that, if you, Guthrie, could give just a little brief overview and then we'll jump into questions.
Sure. Thank you, Alan, for that introduction. It's great to be with you all this evening, coming to you from my home in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's great to be back at Fourth. I was able to visit a few years ago and hold a meeting that my friend Shirley Donaldson helped me arrange at the church. And I just loved being at your church and now being back with you all this evening. The book that I put out in September, my first book, is Just Faith, Reclaiming Progressive Christianity. And I really wrote this book as a love letter to progressive Christians all around the country. I was raised in a progressive Methodist church and by two labor union organizer parents. And so I've been involved in progressive activism and faith-based activism my entire life, and I've been working professionally in the field for the past 10 years. I realized this spring, it was a full decade ago, I got my start working in this field and studying in it and really just being immersed in the long history of faith-based progressive activism and being inspired by so many people that I grew up around, that I went to seminary with, getting to study with Cornel West and James Cone and Phyllis Tribble and these amazing people. And yet throughout my kind of 10 years of working and meeting people all across the country that were doing this work, I felt this persistent feeling of being the outlier or being the exception to how Christians engaged in the public square politically and in terms of activism. I heard over and over again, growing up in the Methodist church, and then I went to Union, which is an interdenominational seminary. I did my field internship at a United Church of Christ and Reformed Church in America, duly aligned church. And now I'm a deacon at a Baptist church here in Louisville. My husband is a PCUSA pastor, one of the first openly LGBTQ people to be ordained in the PCUSA. And across all these different denominations and in others where I've gotten to know people, everybody feels like they're the outlier, that they're part of this maybe small fringe of progressives in their denomination and within American Christianity at large. And yet I kept feeling, well, if you add everybody up, if you add up the Peace Church, I did a lot of, I'm so inspired by the Peace Church tradition and the Christian call to, end war. And we've been at war as a country for the majority of my life. When you add up the Peace Churches with the progressive wings of the different mainline Protestant denominations, progressive evangelical, non-denominational types, progressive Catholics, there are a lot of us. I mean, we're a major force in this country politically. And I over and over again felt this sense of, well, there may be a few people. This one article in the New York Times really set me off a few years ago. It was like talking about the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who I've done a lot of work with, portraying him as this exception to the rule of like how Christians engage in politics. And I'm like, no, there are millions of people standing behind Reverend Barber. And so that's why I wanted to write the book. And I started writing a kind of short article. I write for a number of different magazines like Sojourners, as well as secular news outlets. I have an Easter reflection I just published on Sunday that CNN put out that I'll share in the chat later. But I just kept writing and pouring more out into this one piece, kind of addressing this feeling of being the outlier, and it became a book. I was like, how do you even publish a book? And I did it, and I'm really proud of it. And I'm proud of seeing so many people around the country be a little bit more vocal about our faith as progressive Christians. And I wanted the book to both kind of reflect back the history, the story. So the first half of the book really addresses the history of progressive Christianity over the past 100 years, and how all the advances in terms of progressive economic and social policy in this country, Christians were advocating for those changes. So there's no way of telling the history of the progressive movement in this country without Christianity. And then the second half of the book addresses where we go from here, encouraging people to really recognize our power in the political space, and then be more vocal about our faith. And I address kind of different concerns that I've heard people reflect back to me, whether that's religion doesn't belong in politics, or I don't know how to answer these different things that a conservative religious person might throw back at me, or the idea that, you know, I'm sometimes accused, or people come back at me with kind of Christian nationalism, the idea, you know, that it's like a left wing. We don't want to be like the religious right, you know. We need to keep those things separate. So a lot of different concerns people have that I try to walk through, all towards this goal of being a more vocal, vibrant social movement in this country that's in line with the teachings of Jesus that inspire us all. So that's my overview of what's in the book, why I wrote the book, and I know we have a lot of great questions to get to.
Excellent. Basically, the first question is kind of what's been the reaction to the book? It's been out for what, 6 months? So what sort of reaction have you been getting?
You know, I've gotten so much. I've really been floored by the reaction, both kind of in the progressive Christian media sphere, like National Catholic Reporter and Sojourners positively reviewing it. I mean, just it resonating with people, because I do try to push back on some people that say, you know, we want to keep Christianity out of politics. We don't want to look like the religious right, which I felt was not really out there kind of in those media outlets. So I'm encouraged by the reviews, but then more so, I'm encouraged by the change I've seen since I turned in the manuscript a year ago. I've actually done a lot of work to put a lot of these ideas into practice. In terms of volunteering with this, with the Biden campaigns, kind of campaign within a campaign called Believers for Biden, which was organizing people of faith to be vocal about their faith. I did a lot of work with people that are now in the Biden administration, really uplifting how making it known. I mean, it's always impacted President Biden's faith, but very few people really recognized it. And a new poll came out from Pew Research that shows in the past year, which is about the time that I've really been vocally calling for this, the shift, there's been a lot of work done to make this happen. And the number of Americans who see President Biden as a very religious person has increased, has tripled in the past year. And so I never meant the book to really stand alone. I'm always identified as a writer and an activist. And so I'm most encouraged that we're actually, I feel like, making progress. Reverend Warnock being in the Senate is just, I think, so incredible. And we saw a lot of attacks on Reverend Warnock and attacks on his faith. And also kind of this idea of, should the Democrats and progressives be putting forward a pastor? There was some like keep religion, that thing I was talking about, keeping religion out of it. And it's like, how would you tell Raphael Warnock to keep religion out of politics? He's a pastor. So I'm really encouraged just by the shifts in the political climate. Obviously not going to take credit for all of them, but I do feel like I'm one of the voices in this book has allowed me to really press those points about progressives talking about faith more, and progressive Christians speaking up overtly about our faith in the political square.
That's cool. I really like that fact about the triple the people for Biden realizing that he has a religious background. That's terrific. In the first part of the book, you mentioned it's kind of a historical analysis of all the progressives. And my question is, you got a good mix of famous and not so famous progressive Christian leaders in there. And I'm kind of curious how you decided gets in, who didn't get in the book. What criteria did you use to select the people that you brought forward?
Well, I wanted to show that the progressive history of this country included so many Christians and people that were motivated to enact that progressive change because of their faith. And one of the books that was an aha moment for me was a spiritual biography of FDR, which is one of the pieces in the book that I dive into,
Yep.
which is and I, growing up kind of around democratic politics, I heard about FDR being the great role model for like a really strong progressive reshaping of society where everybody's this creation of the social safety net and everything. And yet I had never heard anyone reference FDR's faith or any sort of mention of how he was driven by his Christian principles. And this book is called A Christian and a Democrat, which is a quote. FDR was asked about what drives his ideology, and he says, well, I'm a Christian and a Democrat. And it seems simple that he would say, first and foremost, I'm a Christian. That's why we need these New Deal reforms. But really, there is a history of the social gospel informing him, informing the people that taught him, and really leading to those, I think, radical and good changes in our society. Another famous person is Martin Luther King Jr., who I talk about how people...
Guthrie, could you go back just maybe about just 30 seconds? You froze up on us.
Oh,
we were starting to get into Martin Luther King, but just maybe back up 30 seconds because we missed it.
I was talking about FDR.
And then you were just about to get into Martin Luther King.
Yeah. And so Dr. King is someone I've heard my entire life kind of referenced in a secular way, which has always been like FDR and straight, even though he was a pastor, and we kind of omit the reverend part. And I talk about how Reverend King is the greatest, religious figure in American history, and not talked about that way, and how we talk today about in our political discussions about Black voters and white evangelical voters, and kind of erase the religiosity of African-American voters in this country, and see their political participation in civil rights movement as an expression of their racial identity and not as an expression of their religious identity. And so whether it's FDR or MLK, economic and racial justice leaders of the past 100 years, I also wanted to uplift how even the issues that get talked about most frequently as like religious right issues there's actually a long history of progressive Christian engagement. So that's LGBTQ rights. I talk about being in seminary in New York City and actually walking by Church of the Village, and which is the United Methodist congregation, and noticing a plaque on the side of the building saying this is where PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, first met, was in a church. And talking about from before the Stonewall riots, there were churches whose immediate reaction was, of course, solidarity with the LGBTQ rights community, which as a gay man, I was not even told. And that kind of myth of Christian opposition to LGBTQ rights persists till today. And then on the other issue that is most often framed negatively is the pro-choice movement. And I talk about the clergy consultation service and how pastors, compelled by their commitment to social justice and compassion and care, helped women before Roe v. Wade access abortion services. And then that turned into the Religious Coalition on Reproductive Choice, and I talk about an interview I did where clergy today are planning with this kind of ultra conservative Supreme Court that we have that could overturn Roe v. Wade, and how clergy are already planning to assist women again in seeking out abortion after Roe v. Wade. And so whatever issue it is, whether it's economic, racial justice, the pro-choice movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, there are Christians living out the gospel as part of that activism. And I realized I was limited in the examples I could bring up, but my goal was to show it's every issue. It's climate, it's immigration. You know, I talk about being at a mass where we serve, where I watch Catholic bishops actually serve communion through the border wall. You know, whatever issue it is in our time or in history, people are putting their faith into that work.
Excellent. Yeah, I got a lot out of it. It was a great mix, and so very helpful. Just one quick follow-up to that. Could you let us know why and how the faith backgrounds of these leaders have been so meticulously erased? That was the interesting thing I got out of these characters, how they had gone about being erased in terms of their religious background.
Well, conservatives don't want to acknowledge because their views are contrary to conservative religious people. So you don't hear it from conservatives. And then many people on the secular left are uncomfortable talking about religion at all. And so you don't hear it from them either. So whether on both sides of the secular left and religious right, nobody is pointing to the religious convictions behind the New Deal, behind the civil rights movement. Of course, I'm generalizing. There are exceptions, but overall, those are the most prominent voices in our culture today. And so that's where I think that's what's driving the silence.
Very good. One thing that I liked about the book, you mentioned that denominations tend to get pulled by the more progressive members. Each denomination kind of pulls the progressives towards the center. And so my question is, how can progressives within the denomination kind of pull their denomination forward? And I really liked one chapter you had that talked about future denominational splits over the same-sex marriage issue was going to open up and allow progressives to take more of a lead in the mainline district denominations. So if you could elaborate on that.
Definitely, I think an example of that is the PCUSA, based here in Louisville, had an amazing week of Black Lives Matter activism last year, where they projected Black Lives Matter on the side of the denomination.
Sorry, Guthrie, could you start your answer again? You hit a little 20-second.
Oh no, I'm
all
sorry.
right. Don't worry about it. It's what the Zoom is. So just if you wouldn't mind starting again.
Alan, I'm not sure if it's him or you because he's not missing for me at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
might actually be.
No problem.
Sorry, but
That could very well be me. Okay, thanks, guys.
but
Thanks
if
for
you're
letting me know.
missing it, it's important for you to hear it.
No,
So
I'm good. I just thought the recording was going to be missing it. No, go ahead. Sorry.
no,
That's
no,
one
no.
of those Zoom things. Is it me or is it you? Where's yeah? So the Black Lives Matter week of action that the PCUSA did, I think since the kind of churches that left the denomination over recognizing the dignity of LGBTQ people has allowed the denomination the freedom to live out the gospel in a more full way. And I saw that in the Black Lives Matter week of action. I've seen that in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which went through its own kind of, evolution in recognizing the dignity of LGBTQ people, and then people, going their own way. They didn't agree with that. And I've been around these changes, personally in my own churches. Growing up, I mentioned earlier, I was in a Methodist church and eventually left because the church doesn't officially recognize same-sex marriage right now. They're going through the process of splitting, which keeps getting delayed because of the pandemic. Actually, they can't hold the meeting to officially have their schism. I growing up, though, I had a pastor who was very vocal in support of LGBTQ rights, which was amazing for me as a teenager, just having that experience, as she was Grand Marshal of Pride in Houston, Texas, where I grew up. And yet I then watched my confirmation teacher and Sunday school teacher and a lot of other families, but like people very close to me as a youth, leave the church over it. but that also allows people to find faith communities where they can thrive. And so I'm hopeful that I was just talking to a Methodist bishop last week about this, that after the schism, the Methodist Church is going to live out the gospel more fully, and there won't be these internal church debates that consume so many people's energy. I went once and it was enough for me to United Methodist Church's General Convention in 2016. My mom and I went and held this banner up. It was amazing. And they didn't do anything. They haven't been doing anything since 1972 over this issue, which has just consumed so much energy. And so after people go their own way and part, those of us in affirming denominations, I feel like, can more fully turn our attention out to society. Well, also there are ongoing issues, and the church is imperfect in living out the gospel. And so we always have to, keep pushing our own internal church structures forward, while also living out those principles and advocating for them as the church today. I think you're muted, Alan.
Sorry. Do you have any insight into strategies for achieving social justice across denominational lines? Can we utilize anything from the evangelical playbook that they have used to work so well across denominational lines?
Absolutely. And this goes back to something I was saying earlier about feeling like we're the only ones in our denomination frequently. So my church here in Louisville, Baptist Church, has been involved in the Black Lives Matter protests around Breonna Taylor's murder. And I heard several people lamenting, oh, we're the only Baptist church here. And that may or may not have been true, or the only church in our Cooperative Baptist Fellowship that was at the protest. And yet there were Lutherans, there was a very active Disciples of Christ Church that was participating, there were Methodists that were there. There were people across different denominations, and yet people were not talking to each other. I recently was doing a book talk at a church in Lower Manhattan in New York City, and I was referencing that I had done another talk at another church that was just a few blocks away, and they had never done any kind of social justice activism together, even though they were right there, just a few blocks from each other. And I've seen that in many different contexts where maybe people at a national level talk, but at the local level, it's like the other churches we know are within our denomination. And what the Christian right has done so well is put aside different theological debates. And you see a kind of united front from conservative Mormons, evangelicals, Catholics, and all those groups holding exclusive faith claims, much stronger than what divides, I think, different mainline traditions, and yet working together on areas of social, what they view as activism for the causes that they care about. So there's a lot to learn. There's a lot more to be done between progressive Catholics and progressive Protestants. I mean, I'm so inspired by, the person I think I quote perhaps the most in the book is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is Catholic, and yet I think represents my political and social views more than anybody in American politics today, and is inspired by her Catholic faith, just like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. And there are so many the nuns on the bus. I don't know if y'all have heard of I see some nodding heads. I mean, some of the best social justice activism in my lifetime was nuns on the bus. And so I hope can be more both within the different Protestant denominations, and then also finding the progressive Catholic voices and communities to not to pull each other into each other's churches, but to advocate together for areas of common concern.
Excellent. You say in the book that just by getting greater awareness of the fact that there's all these progressive Christians, this is going to help shift the view of Christianity towards the left. Could you elaborate on how this awareness in and of itself could be used to reclaim Christianity?
Sure. And this is a topic I really focused on in my Easter reflection and in the book, which is, I can't tell you how many times I tell people I'm going to church. When I was in seminary, when I would tell people that I would meet in New York, it's hard to avoid when people ask, like, what do you do? Why did you move here? And I'm like, seminary, and their eyes bug out and they're just like, what? And it's like, how can you be this progressive, gay, like activist type person and go to church? And where do they get that idea? Where, like, I just ask myself over and over again, where does this idea come? There are progressive, it was in New York City, there were progressive churches all around us. And yet people that I meet, neighbors are like, you go to church, and my husband's a pastor, and they're like, really, like, like we're aliens visiting from Mars or something. And I think what drives that is hearing so much in our culture, and people that maybe don't think about Christianity and religion very often. Our views are shaped by the media, by what we hear on the news, what we hear from Trump and all the evangelicals who stood by Trump, and all those messages that are repeated over and over again just permeate our culture and really just erase progressive Christians. In the book I mentioned, there was a CNN article about two Presbyterian pastors meeting with former President Trump. And he goes, I did well with the evangelicals. That's what, of course, he greets them by praising himself. That's not surprising. And they go, we're not evangelicals, we're Presbyterians. And he doesn't understand. He has no understanding, even though he was raised in a Presbyterian church. He has no understanding of what of a Christian who's not an evangelical. And I think that's a big problem. It's not just Trump, it's anybody that is a kind of low information about religion person. All they hear about is evangelicals, Trump, all of that mess. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but my particular calling and vocation, I feel, is working on this media piece, and also addressing how I kept hearing about Westboro Baptist Church my entire life. This tiny church that has like 10 members and is clearly awful, but got more media attention per member of their church than any church in America. And I wonder, like, if churches that even moderate or to progressive churches that got that kind of media attention, how the average person would view Christianity differently.
Great. What about across different faiths? And as well as there was a lot of progressive sort of no faith or unaffiliated, huge group. Do you have any perspective of how we might partner with them, serve together for social justice?
Sure, there's so much that can be done across different religious traditions. The Jewish social justice sector is something that is really inspiring, a lot of good different organizations that are doing advocacy. The Muslim social justice sector is growing as the Muslim population in our country is the kind of fastest growing faith group in developing a political voice, which is really exciting to see. And I think more than anything, progressive Christians love to do interfaith work because they're nervous about talking about Christianity in the public square, and much more comfortable talking about interfaith things because it's more inclusive, which is wonderful. There shouldn't, prevent us from talking about something that is uniquely Christian, which is we don't need to keep out of the public square. And then the kind of growing nuns, not the nuns on the bus, but the NES is fascinating. And there's new poll came out last week from Gallup showing for the first time since Gallup started asking this question in 1937, the majority of Americans do not belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, is how Gallup asked the question. And there was a lot of consternation. And yet, my reaction was the church is not the church should better live up to the values of Jesus to attract people to come. I mean, the young, it's highly correlated to age, people leaving churches. And yet young people today are the generation that I think at a broad level most reflect the values Jesus cared about, are out in the streets protesting, are doing the work of social justice, are pushing boundaries, are doing this work that they don't see reflected in many churches. So it makes sense to me. And the numbers about belief in other indicators that are not a reflection on the institutional church are not going down as much, such as belief in God, such as expressing awe or wonder in the universe. I mean, spirituality and religion are hard things to poll in general, but the polls we do have show that the people's sense of spirituality, wonder, belief are not going down as much as ties to institutions. And I think that reflects more on institutions. So I would start by saying, yes, work with people that have no faith. Don't judge people that are not formally tied to churches, and be surprised when people actually see the church living out its mission and then they want to join.
Beautiful. One of the quotes you use in the book that I really like is your definition of use words. Use words is shorthand for letting people know that what you're doing and advocating for is done in the name of following Jesus. So my question is, how should we let people know the reason behind what we are doing in an authentic way, not a corny way? How do we get over the fear of making our personal testimony to others?
I always think about my grandmother, who I dedicated the book to and helped raise me and moved in with my family when we were young, and who passed away while I was writing this book. And she spent a lot of her years after my grandfather died as a missionary in Mexico and also a social activist working with undocumented people in Houston to make sure their needs were met. And we'd go to protests as a family, and she would always write a little Bible verse down on a little piece, like on a cardboard sign. And I always loved that because it was authentic, right? She lived out, it wasn't a political prop at all. If you knew my grandmother, everyone in the community knew how real her faith was. And it was authentic that's what compelled her to, go to an anti-war protest or join my parents on the picket line. So it was authentic and it was explicit, which is the part that always stuck out to me. Is I would look around and not see a lot of people who were making their faith so clear in terms of why they were joining. I know if people are asked often, they'll say, it was, where do these values come from? And they might say, oh, I learned them in church, or I heard a sermon about this. But putting your faith out there and using words explicitly is often frowned upon. Like I want my faith to be seen through my actions, not my words, but we need to use words because that voice is not being heard. I talk about a reflection Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had at the Riverside Church after the election, and she's lamenting how the Christian vote was seen as going to Donald Trump in the 2016 election, even though Hillary was a lifelong Methodist, got into politics because she had this very social justice oriented youth pastor, and had said in interviews that if she didn't get into politics, she would have gone into ministry. It was that big a part of her life. And she says, I always thought it would be, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, it's in the book, but she said, I always thought it would be evident from my actions. Like that's what was compelling me. And yet the average person only heard Trump saying, you know, I'm going to appoint judges that will ban abortion for the evangelicals over and over again. And they never heard Hillary talk about it that much. And that works. That's obviously maybe not everyone on this call is going to run for president and have that kind of a platform, but that same dynamic really filters down to individual interactions that shape our entire political culture, where people are only hearing about how faith impacts politics from the right. A lot of people are trying to live it out, but we also need to use words.
Very helpful. Thank you. What about when we get to family and friends who think all Christians are conservative and evangelical, right? How do we claim our faith and avoid the fear of identifying as Christian in a one-on-one conversation?
You know, that is the place primarily where people can share their testimony, their witness, what drives them. And it can also be the hardest because it's a vulnerable thing. It's people's spirituality and beliefs are very closely held for so many people. And yet I've done my whole career has been in political advocacy, and the people that change others' minds the most are the people closest to them. So I think you have a responsibility, and it can be very difficult to actually have those tough, vulnerable conversations with people who you're closest to about your faith. And I've seen, just since I've written the book, my aunt opened up to me about a lot of things. I always knew she was kind of a church-going person, but she opened, up about how hard it was. She had to leave her church over, the church's stance about LGBTQ issues, and really kind of shared more with me because, I'd put so much out there that people feel very comfortable talking to me about it. But I would say that starting that conversation and really opening it up and hearing what other people may think, they may the kind of counter force to the cultural misperceptions about Christianity are all of us having those conversations and making our presence known to people who want to hear from us.
In the last chapter, you advocate for progressive Christians to set a bold vision. I really like that chapter. Bold vision for what loving thy neighbor would really look like in an inclusive, kind of realistic way in today's world. I really got energized by that chapter. And I'm wondering if you could give us insight into how all people of faith could work together to kind of develop this bold vision and really unify around this love of neighbor. I really like that idea.
I think the core conviction for people of faith is the core conviction of what motivates progressive activism, social justice activism, which is a concern for not just yourself. That, yeah, you made a lot of money, but, I love how Elizabeth Warren always did this during the campaign. You made a lot of money, great, but you didn't build the roads that, that allowed you to function in society, right? It's caring for other people, caring for the common good, caring for not just that my tax rates are lower or that I have, my kid is in a good school, that kind of core value of caring about other people, of really wanting my neighbor, all of my neighbors in my community, all of my neighbors in this country. And I think for so many of us, all of our neighbors around the world, whether that impacts our views on immigration or stopping war, is out of this neighborliness, this core conviction that Jesus preached, which was always, I want, people coming to Jesus and saying, I want to draw a boundary. Are they in or are they out? And Jesus's answer was always to expand who was in, and always to ask us to expand our sense of neighborliness. And so that being a good neighbor, sound like Mr. Rogers, good Presbyterian, not often, talk about our culture, not often cited as a Presbyterian. that kind of core loving your neighbor as yourself, which extends, like you said, across religions, that golden rule mentality, is what drives the basic sense of everybody should have all of their material needs met. Everybody should have a life of be able to, we have the material resources right now to ensure every person in this world has access to water, to shelter, to basic standards of living. We can do that today if we embrace this message of loving your neighbor. And so, that's the next book I'm going to work on.
It's great. I love that
connecting
chapter.
people of faith all around the world, into this core value of there's enough. Jesus said, we're called to abundant life. There's an abundance of everything we have and need right now. And we can do it in a sustainable way that honors creation and the earth. So I'm glad you found that inspiring. I tried to end on a positive note.
That was good.
After getting some of the more difficult things. And really, that is what we're about as Christians. It's what many religious traditions are about. And it's what we're trying to do in the political square, even though it sometimes gets ugly and it doesn't look like Sunday school.
Excellent.
But it's that same drive.
So I think it's about time that we kind of open the floor up. And I'd like to recognize Debbie and Craig. They've got a question.
Yeah, I just have a comment and a question. One, the comment is, it seems to me that a lot of progressives are afraid of alienating the more conservative elements in the church community. Therefore, they say nothing. Therefore, while the conservatives have really become very media savvy and have launched these media campaigns so the media only pays attention to them, nothing's happening on the progressive side. And I really think that we should start addressing this and start getting more PR for the progressives. Second, I was really impressed by your mention of those clobber verses that the conservatives use, because I was clobbered about a year and a half ago by a conservative where I mentioned that I really thought people should be following what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And the response from this conservative was that, well, the first chapter of the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Therefore, that meant that Jesus was the one that said all those things in the Old Testament, and that's what we should really be following. And I was just speechless. I was clobbered. So how can we come up with our own clobber verses to respond to these people?
I would say I always come back to, what does Jesus say the most important thing is? Like it's people can pick out different verses, whether that's from the Gospels, the rest of the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible. But the core, Jesus is asked, what's the most important commandment? And so we have a very clear guide. It's to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the same thing. So that goes back to the love your neighbor ethic is the core. And loving your neighbor is in terms of like saying, I think that would be a really tough interfaith conversation, to tell someone that's Jewish, Jesus actually wrote all of your, wrote the Hebrew Bible. So it's like from a core, love your neighbor is the core ethic that Jesus spells out. And then I always go to Luke 4. I was thinking today a lot, I want to write something. This is just an idea I had today about missionaries. Because I saw someone asking about they were going to write an article about missionaries. And I was like, well, we don't really like that word in progressive Christian circles. You don't hear a lot of talk about missionaries, but a missionary is someone that lives out the mission of the church. And Jesus spells out the mission of the church, citing Isaiah in Luke 4, which is to free the oppressed, set the captives free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That is the mission. And so missionaries are people that are setting the oppressed free. But I try not to get, in terms of effective communications, I try not to get back and forth about different Bible verses, because that person is probably we all only have so many breaths in our life. And I don't want to spend many of them arguing with somebody that's never going to be won over and probably is getting a high just from arguing with me. So,
but that's
yeah.
that's what the people in favor of slavery did. I read some other book a couple months ago that the people who were for slavery before the Civil War had all these Bible verses they quoted, and the abolitionists had nothing. And it seemed like they were on the losing end. So I think that we should be more proactive about this and not just sit back and let them take over the show, because in essence, that is really what's happening now. They're capturing all the media attention. They're monopolizing their interpretation of the Bible, which I think is incorrect. And they're trying to clobber everybody with it. And I think we should have some comebacks.
I completely agree with you, Debbie, 100%. And it's the work of all of us. It's the work of the PR executives. So many times people leave this work up about like what the church does in the public square to ordain clergy, or, like that's my pastor's, or that's the denomination's job. But it's really all of our jobs, whether that's in our using the skills we have, writers, I know I've been talking to somebody who's doing a whole documentary about some of these issues, whatever skills and gifts you have, using them. I hope we can all do that. And yeah, and just on the slavery point, it's also sadly currently I just saw this week a group at Baylor University is mad that people are looking back into Baylor's founding and the history and people's views of the founders, and said, actually slavery was ordained by God, this group of students now. So a lot of these issues don't go away, those really terrible interpretations of the Bible. And yet there are so many, there's such a long history of abolitionists being inspired by scripture as well.
Could you maybe go after Kelly Lynch's question? It kind of relates to that. How do we get the conversation started?
Yeah, people, I obviously only talk about religion and politics. So the question is, how do, the rule is today seems to be that you shouldn't talk about religion or politics with friends. How do we open the door to those conversations? I think that's a really good question. And I want to affirm that that impulse to not, make someone uncomfortable, offend somebody, talking about things that are difficult is a good one, right? We don't want to unnecessarily upset people. And yet, as I think Debbie was saying earlier, there is that louder voice that they're hearing in the culture. And we can only make change within people, you're only going to change people's minds if you have a relationship with them or some trust that you can build up. And that happens in these one-on-one situations. I can't tell you how many times people will say like the pastor should just preach about it. It's like, great, the pastor should preach about it. Yes. I have a strong anti-clerical streak, but that I am married to a pastor, so it's okay. The pastor will preach about it, and then everyone, and the assumption is because the pastor preached about it, everyone now thinks that way. That's not how communication works. I don't know if y'all just listen to a sermon and immediately believe whatever was said, but that's the theory of change. And yet we know that the call is for everybody to work within their sphere of influence. And so I've had people, say they sent someone just in the past few months, they'll be like, I never knew how to talk about religion with my parents, so I sent them your book. I was like, well, that's one way, send them an article or a book or something and say, I want to talk to you about it. Sit down and maybe invite them to church with you if they're from a different tradition, and say, maybe there's a different, if you hear someone talking really negatively about Christians, you could invite them to come to Fourth and experience something different. I think there are different ways to start that conversation, but it's really important to get past that kind of awkwardness. And I do feel like people are more comfortable talking about politics for whatever reason, maybe not, But the religion thing, because it's so negatively, has such a negative association for so many people, I would have people in seminary with me. I won't name names since this is being recorded, but who would say who would basically say I'm in graduate school or just avoid it completely. These are people in seminary who didn't want to bring it up because there are so many negative cultural connotations right now.
Any other questions out there?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Lucy. I'm one of the pastors here and work with Adult Ed. And I just wonder where the silence came, as you have traced this through, where did the silencing of good, hearty, meaty engagement with religion, where did that kind of arrive from? That's one question. And then probably a comment. I have a wondering if kind of mainline Protestants particularly feel a little intimidated when you start getting into the territory of religious discourse, because we feel like we are just so, I mean, it goes back to the question of getting in, in arguments with people and somebody's always got a Bible verse in their hip pocket and you're just silenced by it. But I wonder if it really sometimes has also to do with us being intimidated or afraid or simply feel inadequate to have those conversations. So it's two pieces of that same question about, where did it come from? And then how do we prepare more helpfully or more adequately, or how do we have this conversation?
Let me do the second question first and then come back because I'm not sure I understood the first, but I understood the second. I think we need to think through some basic kind of advocacy and persuasion tools that are not really related to the church, but just in advocacy and political or any kind of communication, you have people that are already with you, sometimes called the choir, or then you have the base, like people that agree with you on whatever subject you're talking about. Then you have people that are persuadable, that don't have their minds made up, that you present an argument to them, they haven't thought about the issue, or they don't, have never thought about, progressive Christianity, or there's a different way to be the church, or, low information people. And there's a lot of those people. And then you have people that are opposed. And then you have, and just in advocacy communications, people that are unreachable and just really strong activists, believe as strongly about religion and activism as I do, but completely opposed. And those people are the ones that are often intimidating. At a conference I was speaking at, a woman came up to me just almost on the verge of tears and says, every time I mention I'm a Democrat and a Christian, someone starts yelling about me about genocide and murdering babies and abortion. And she's like, I don't know how to ever bring up my faith and how it leads me to, care about progressive politics because someone starts yelling at me about abortion. And I think that's the same thing with different Bible verses, wanting to get in thinking someone can shut me down by quoting Leviticus to me about then their misinterpretation about same-sex relationships and the holiness of same-sex marriage. And we have to remember that those people that are like angry, just going to bring up abortion unprovoked and just start yelling about it, are a vocal and very small fringe of society. And yet will stand up, I speak in public places and people will stand up and say things. And I think we need to remember in all of our conversations and in trying to make a difference that there are a lot of people that can be reached that are not in that kind of fringe, unreachable, never going to change their mind, is going to yell at you. And we don't necessarily need or have to engage those people. There's plenty of work for us to do amongst the kind of proverbial middle of people that haven't heard this message. But I do want to go back to your first question.
let's not do that one, okay? Because there's a couple other really good questions and we don't have time. But basically, just to be clear, what I was trying to get at is whether or not the whole idea of robust, engaged disagreement might just be something that could be really healthy in our culture, because we've gotten so silenced, I think, by all the scary stuff. So that's kind of where that was coming from. But I'm happy to defer to other, there's at least one other question that Jerry was asking that it's really, I think, a great one. So thank you. Sorry.
That is so true. And I love engaging with people that disagree with me about a number of different issues. I've done a lot of work with the Southern Baptist Convention, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, people that, disagree with my right to be married, and yet, may agree on creating a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented, or there may be other areas where we can find, it's really hard for two people to sit down and not agree about something. And so I really love that work of acknowledging our differences and acknowledging we are appealing to different parts of Scripture, and then seeing where we can engage. So Jerry's question is, do we need another Reverend Dr. MLK in our world to lead the progressive Christians? Do you see anyone today that could fill this role? I think Reverend William Barber and leading the Poor People's Campaign is probably the closest, or Reverend Warnock, in being a kind of of course, the Reverend Warnock is the successor to Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and so has a direct line to MLK and Junior and MLK Senior at Ebenezer Baptist. So, but I'd also be wary of any one leader. It's the work of all of us. It's the work of every single person, not just the, people at the Presbyterian Church's office in Washington, D.C. to do this work. Though they are great and do great work, it's every person's and every church's job to live this out. But I do think we need to be better organized. So I would not say more charismatic leaders, but more organizing infrastructure. And more, so I do some work with a group called Faithful America, which is a wonderful organization that does but it's all online organizing and getting people they have a community of 180,000 progressive Christians, both Protestant and Catholic. And there's been great work done by Sojourners and Jim Wallace to organize people. And the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber is doing that kind of work to get people into committees and local state chapters. Faith in Public Life is another one that I mentioned in the book. They have some state chapters and then a national organization as well. So we do need better in terms of the PR. I love that idea of more PR. Yeah, we need that organizing infrastructure, the PR firms that are pushing out messages and ads and billboards. I see so many wacky Christian billboards. I would love to buy, I think I could raise some money, right, for a bunch of progressive Christian billboards, the less like hell is real. I see so many of those, and they, we need better billboards. Anyway, yeah, there's so much to do.
My favorite quote of the whole book is, "It's for people whose devotion to God isn't about escaping hell, but about being called to co-create a just world." Fabulous quote, Guthrie. So that could be a billboard. That's a billboard right there.
Craig has a question.
Oh, go ahead, Craig. Sorry.
More partly a comment, partly a question. Fourth Church is the second or third largest church in this denomination, which is a big denomination. And we're not quite a mega church, but we're kind of the only one that practices traditional worship as opposed to having a praise band on the platform every morning. Anyway, how can we become a vanguard in getting the message out that there's such a thing as progressive Christianity? We seem cowed by all these evangelicals who come out spouting this, that, and the other thing. And I hope Lucy is listening right now.
That is a great question. I think supporting, whether that's in local and state activism, as well as the work the Presbyterian Church is doing nationally, being a strong supporter of that, being I don't know how you're kind of organized internally. If I think this is like the education committee, right, that organized this event. So I don't know if you have a committee that does more like organizing to go to a local protest or support a kind of any kind of social justice activism that's happening locally. And then there are different calls for people to go to, Reverend Barbara will put out a call for people to come to DC and talk about economic dignity and ending poverty. And so, getting a bus, different churches will organize buses of people to go to DC when the call is put out. I think sharing different actions that are happening, whether it's nationally, state, or locally, to the church community, and making sure everyone can be plugged into different roles, having people from the community that are at secular nonprofits come to the church and really push both in terms of direct aid and social services to people. So having somebody, whether that's a food pantry, I think food pantry is a great example, because we can be both supporting food pantries and, directly providing food to people, but also working to make sure the city council and different policymakers end as a policy measure in poverty, which is totally feasible. And I feel like that first part of doing the social services direct aid is much more comfortable for a lot of churches than being, so directly saying to policymakers, we need a budgets or moral documents. So that's a few ideas.
Thank you.
But please keep me updated if you come up with any idea. I'd love to know how this talk led to people maybe seeing if there was an advocacy committee or what they're doing right now at Fourth.
We used to have one. I don't know if people remember, but I'm not sure if it's still active. So it's probably time to revisit that.
I think so. Yeah, excellent. So I think it makes sense to put a pin in it at this point. We've hit our hour. It was excellent. Thank you so much, Guthrie, for taking the time to share with us about this great book. I encourage everybody to go out and buy it. Great book.
Thank you, Polly. I see it there. That's great.
Thank you so much. It was an excellent book. Really enjoyed it. And I'm an American University alum too, so it was fun to read.
Wonderful.
Yeah. A lot longer ago than you though, so.
And I read it in ebook. I bought the ebook. It was a great book.
Yeah.
Also available on Audible, not read by me. I don't know how it sounds. I couldn't bear to listen to it. I had to listen to all the auditions, which was anyway. So you can also get it on Audible if you prefer to listen to books. But thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, next Tuesday's book club is the first Tuesday in May. See you then.
Thank you.
All right.